But it is my great pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Cristian Vaccari. I am a professor of political communication at Loughborough University and the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics. As you all know, everything is different this year, and our conference is different as well. This is the 6th edition of the conference, a tradition that was started by my predecessor, Rasmus Claes-Nielsen, and that I happily continued. It's the first time that we are running this conference virtually, and I don't think this is the first virtual conference for most of us, and we all know that it is a great shame not to be able to see each other and have the kinds of personal interactions that normally can take place at conferences like this. And I would say IJPP is a really collegial and friendly conference for those who can attend. But at the same time, we are, I hope, going to take advantage of the opportunity of a genuinely global conference where people that could not have been able to travel to Loughborough to present or to attend the conference are now going to be able to join us. If you followed my Twitter account or some Facebook pages that I occasionally spam, you will have seen that we are going to have a truly global conference this year, or maybe truly global is too much, but as I hope you can see from my screen, we have now passed 500 registered participants, not including the presenters, and those participants
500 people here, and people don't use hello everyone.
Come from the global north and the rich west, but there is a pretty good representation of colleagues from all over the world, all 5 continents, and I do hope that this means that our conversations are more inclusive, they are more interesting, and they take into account perspectives that research based on the Western tradition and the Western paradigm and conferences rooted in those institutions sometimes cannot take fully into account. As you know, we have a very busy program, so we'll try to keep the schedule going. We have 11 panels where a total of 36 panels will be presented. We have a roundtable on Thursday, which I'm very excited about, on how we try to bridge the gaps between global scholarship in the North and the South in terms of what gets published in international journals and in terms of the kind of research that gets done and the kind of research that we're not aware of because it doesn't get published in our journals or presented in our conferences. As a good example of what we can do with the virtual conference that we would have been more difficult to do in a physical conference, we're also going to honor the winners of the Best Book Award of the journal, which is something that, to my knowledge, we haven't been able to do at previous conferences because maybe the authors of the book would not attend the conference, but we can do it right now, and I think this is a good way to get us started. Not only because we're celebrating a fantastic book, Words of Journalism. I hope you can see it through the background, but also because this book is not only an amazing piece of scholarship, but it's a model example of how research in journalism and political communication can be made more global and can tackle the global challenges that we're all interested in solving. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Thomas Hanitzsch, who is going to present some thoughts around the project. Just a bit of housekeeping very briefly. Please, everyone, apart from those who are presenting, keep your microphones off. And please do engage with the chat. There is a button for those of you who haven't done much Zoom these days, lucky you perhaps. There is a chat button at the bottom of your Zoom interface. Please keep that chat open because that's going to be the place where we are going to have most of the discussion. So I'll introduce the format of the panels after this award ceremony, if you will. But before that, I'm very happy to give the floor to Thomas Hanitzsch and his co-authors who are going to tell us a bit about the book and the project and what's happening moving forward. Thomas, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristian, for your kind introduction and for giving us the chance to talk about the book a little bit and the project. Let me start my presentation, and then I will try to share it so that all of you can see it. So now you should be able to see the presentation.
Yeah, it's clear, Thomas, yeah.
Can you see it? Okay, thank you. All right, so first of all, of course, everyone working on this book, editing the book and contributing chapters to the book, everyone feels very honored to have received this important book award. I mean, it's at the end of this whole journey, it's really something very good to hold in your hands after you invested years after years into such a massive project. It's been a lot of work, but it's also been very exciting. And so in the beginning, let me please talk a little bit about the project as such. Then I will give you a snapshot of some of our key findings, and I will end up with an outlook about or on our future activities. To start with, the Worlds of Journalism study is actually existing for a couple of years. It exists since 2006, when we started with a small pilot project, and then started growing amazingly. So people from various nations came up and asked whether they can join the project. And as of today, we are a project consisting of scholars from more than 120 countries. And that's actually, I think, a record that's never been achieved in the field of communication studies. But at the same time, it's exactly what you said, Cristian, at the beginning, that we often deal with theories and research from Western countries, and then we try to apply it to the non-Western world. And the only thing what we realize, or what we often realize, is that these paradigms often fail because they do not quite hold up to the realities on the ground in the global south. So the major impetus of this project has always been, from the very beginning, to capture the whole universe of journalistic cultures, of articulations of journalism around the world, not starting out from one particular paradigm, Western or not, but to try to capture a global panopticon of different journalistic cultures. And for that, we have already executed 2 waves of surveys of journalists, first in 21 countries and second 67 countries. And the second wave is actually the empirical material, the beef that we used for the book Worlds of Journalism. Before Corona, we tried to meet every year. So these annual meetings actually give this whole project a very important impetus in terms of keeping alive the spirit within the project, giving people a sense of belonging, that all scholars united in this project get the feeling that they belong to something larger, that they have a home, and there are other people around the world studying the same stuff, the same things all of us are working on. And the way we are organized in this project, I think is also very unique if you compare this project with other ones. Because at some point, it was about 10 years ago, when the project started growing over 30 countries, we felt simply overwhelmed by the complexity and cultural diversity we developed within this project. And so we started experimenting with new structures, managerial structures within the project. So one of the first things we did was we broke the various countries into 7 different world regions. At the time, it was Africa, by which we actually meant Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and North America, and a large cluster of countries that one could subsume under the West. We have been experimenting with different regional structures, but that's the current one. And so in each of these regions, we have 1 or 2 outstanding scholars doing regional coordination. Because as we are now more than 120 countries, it is impossible for a single researcher to manage, to coordinate a project of this magnitude. So regional coordinators are well connected within the regions. They oftentimes speak the languages, and they have a deeper knowledge of the cultures involved. And so these principal investigators, and that's just another interesting feature of this project, these regional coordinators are not appointed by some mysterious authority or by the founders of this project, but they are elected by the principal investigators in their regions. So we actually introduced democracy into this project, and we are doing this now for almost 10 years. And we feel that this inbuilt democracy in the project is a great advantage to all of us, because for one, it gives regional coordinators who together form the executive committee of the study, it gives them democratic authority. So there is established leadership in this project that is accepted by all members, and everyone has a person to speak to when it comes to simple issues such as, how should I go about sampling? There is a significant number of journalists I cannot reach out to, what should I do? So there are questions, methodological and theoretical questions, that regional coordinators can actually respond to in a much more accurate and timely fashion than a single person can actually do. And in addition to that, we have a scientific advisory committee advising the project on from an external point of view. These are scholars, but also practitioners and people representing stakeholders. Especially, this is important, especially as we are now collaborate with international organizations such as UNESCO, the International Federation of Journalists, and Reporters Without Borders. And so all these stakeholders are trying to give us advice in terms of, are we asking the right questions? Are the issues we're tackling in this project the most urgent ones in journalism studies? So overall, are we marching into the right direction? And then we have a statistical advisory committee, which we introduced at a point when we realized that statistical expertise is not evenly distributed in the world, to say the least. So there are principal investigators and scholars in certain nations lacking the statistical expertise or some statistical expertise for analyzing the data. And so we are trying to help them in all kinds of data analysis. Now, the research focus of the last wave of the Worlds of Journalism study has been multifaceted, so to say. Of course, at the center of the project was the idea of comparing journalism culture or journalistic culture around the world. But as the concepts we studied, we put into focus the following ones: journalistic roles, journalism ethics, journalists and trust, the transformation of journalism, and autonomy and influences on journalism. So these were the major concepts that were assessed and analyzed and also presented in the book. In terms of conceptual underpinnings, I can be only very brief here, we detail the conceptual framework in the book. It's basically about two areas or two dimensions or broad dimensions of journalistic culture: extrinsic and intrinsic. And extrinsic is perceived influences on journalism and editorial autonomy as perceived by the journalists. And intrinsic is journalistic roles, journalistic ethics, and journalists' trust. In the following, I will give you a very small snapshot of our findings pertaining to journalistic roles. And that you can see here, it's only a very tiny area of an actually much larger and much more complex study. And for each of these areas, we try to identify contextual influences. So why are journalistic roles different from country to country? So why do journalists perceive higher influences in some countries than in others? So, and these contextual influences come from, on the one hand, from politics and governance, how democratic is a country, what does the way of governance, for instance, transparency vis-a-vis corruption, how does that influence journalism? That's one area. The second area is socio-economic development. Basically, economic development and human development, does that influence the way journalistic cultures are articulated around the world? And third, cultural value system. So how does culture, broadly speaking, impact on journalistic culture? So this is, in a nutshell, is the basic conceptual approach we've been using for the book and for the study. Speaking of methodology, again, very briefly, our methodology was collaboratively developed from the early beginning. So we try to involve as many as possible people from various nations in developing our questionnaire, our methodological framework, and development of field procedures. Data collection took place between 2012, 2016. We cover 67 countries. And the data set includes more than 27,500 interviews with journalists in the various countries. One aspect that was very important to us was data screening and data processing. We centralized this in Munich, so all the countries, all principal investigators sent us their data, and we did our best to make sure that the data is reliable and useful and valid for analytical purposes. Now, I said I can present only very little in terms of our empirical findings, and I hope that you will have the time at some point to read the book or to read a summary of these findings, which is also published in various journals. When it comes to journalistic roles, we reason that there are 4 major bundles of journalistic roles one can identify for the purpose of comparing countries. I need to say that this approach is specifically tailored to the comparison of countries. And if you want to study single nations, you may find a different approach more useful. But for the comparison of countries, we identified 4 large bundles. One is monitorial roles, which means provides political information citizens need to participate in political activity. It is a type of journalism that monitors and scrutinizes politics, that holds politicians to account, and that motivates people to participate in politics. So that's a very classic approach of Western journalism, or that is often tagged to the idea of Western journalism. And as you will see, the idea of monitorial journalism is actually pretty widespread around the world. On the other end of this continuum, there is another bundle of roles that we call collaborative. A collaborative role understanding means a culture of journalism in which journalists conceive of themselves as supporters of the government. As the government is, for instance, is trying to bring about social and economic well-being to my country, so it is my duty to support the government in achieving their goals. That means the journalists as an institution and politics and the government, they share certain common goals, which is oftentimes economic, social, and cultural development. The statements you see listed under the role bundles, these are actually the statements we used in the questionnaire. So journalists were given the chance to say to what extent they agree to each of these statements. And this is how we measured role perceptions. Now the third role bundle we called interventionist roles. interventionism in this context means that a journalist is not conceiving of himself or herself as a bystander, but as a person who involves him or herself in social and political activity. So the journalist is not the objective observer, but it's a person who makes an intervention in culture and in politics, which means in many countries to advocate for social change, to actually influence public opinion in a certain way, to drive political agenda in a certain direction and support national development, whatever that entails. Now, finally, the fourth bundle of roles we called accommodative. Accommodative in that respect means journalists feel the urge to give the publics what they want. And oftentimes when it comes to journalism, the public wants news that attract the largest audience. Interesting news, sensational news, news that also entertain and provide relaxation, or news that are actually not so much pertaining to the political, but to everyday needs of people in their everyday lives, like advice, orientation, and giving direction in certain areas, such as consumption or psychological development and others. So these were the four role bundles we have been using to compare journalistic cultures around the world. Now here, and this again is a snapshot of our findings, here you see the distribution of country means. That's actually something that we call violin plots. And these violin plots, they show us how country means cluster around a certain maximum. So you see when it comes to monitorial roles, the distribution of country means is actually so that you find many countries clustering in a certain area between say 3.2 and 3.6. So that's a small corridor in which you find most of the countries, and the distribution is relatively normal. So that means that there is not certain groups of countries in terms of monitorial roles. Most countries cluster around a common mean, and that's very different for interventionist roles. Here we can actually see there's two groups of countries. One group of countries holds interventionist roles in very high regard. And another group of countries, a smaller one, in these countries, journalists have much less appreciation for the interventionist roles. So here we have an indication of groups, of country groups, and the same could be said for collaborative roles. For collaborative roles, we say a similar structure of something like a peanut bean, where you have one group of countries in which journalists say collaborative roles are not something that I hold up to. And then there's another group of countries, a smaller group of countries, where the collaborative role is much more of importance. So now here you see the distribution of country averages relating to all of these four dimensions. For one, this is, before I continue, I need to ask if my collaborator, Jyotika, is in the session. If you are, please drop me a message so that I know if you want to add something or not. Oh, okay, close this. Now back to the comparison. Here you see the averages of countries across all the four dimensions. And there you see, if you look to the lower right, you see a cluster of Western countries where you have a very high regard for monitorial roles, but also for accommodative roles. You see that many Western countries, they are clustered together. United States is there, Switzerland, Austria, Iceland, Australia, UK, Italy, just to name a few. And you see that, of course, journalistic culture in these countries may be different to some extent, but overall, you see that they are still strikingly different from other countries. If I move to the other direction, to the left, you see countries such as Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, China, Singapore, Oman, Malaysia. In these countries, journalistic culture is much more dominated by a collaborative approach. Here, journalists do see themselves more as functioning as supportive tools to developing the country or to supporting the country. Now, if you look at the upper half of the chart, there you see clusters of countries, many of which have a close proximity to the interventionist pole. So in these countries, journalists pay a very high regard to interventionist journalism. In previous studies, one would have said that's a kind of developmental or development journalism. And in fact, it is. For most of the countries, such as the Philippines or Mexico, El Salvador, which are clustering in the middle. But there is other groups of countries in which this developmental approach is blended with a monitorial approach, as you can see for countries such as Croatia or South Korea, where journalists still feel, in my country, there is still a lot of things to do. The country still needs to change a lot, but these are countries which usually have a functioning democracy. And in these functioning democracy, journalists also have the job of monitoring powers that be. So a monitorial approach is blended with an interventionist approach. In another group of countries, these countries are typically less democratic and have much less economic development, such as Sierra Leone, Bangladesh, or Ecuador. In these countries, an interventionist approach is blended with a collaborative approach. And so you see there are different approaches to interventionism in journalism, or different approaches to developmental or developmentalist journalism. Okay, time is ticking so fast. I could tell, of course, a lot more about this. I could give you some comparison of journalistic roles and how they relate to democracy or press freedom and other indices. But this book has been edited by 4 scholars. And I just learned Jyotika is finally here. And by the way, there's been 40 people from different nations contributing to that book. And I would like to give the remaining minutes to Jyotika to add a few words from her perspective. Jyotika, please take over.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Thomas, and greetings to everyone. We are all in different time zones, so I'm not going to say good morning or good afternoon, but thank you for being with us at this time. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about the experience of being part of this project and part of this book, just to give it a very different perspective apart from what Thomas already spoke about. So today, very often the word team science has become quite common to use. We engage in team science by having people from many different fields contribute to one project so that we are not in some kind of siloed thinking, and we are able to think about things from perspectives that we are not familiar with. And so a term that my colleague Thomas Hanitzsch coined was a committee approach, which was kind of the approach we used here. And while we were not scientists or scholars from different fields, we were scholars from many different parts of the world, which was really important for this project. And what he defined this committee approach as was an interdisciplinary and multicultural team of individuals who have expert knowledge in the cultures, languages, and research field in question to develop all of our tools together And not only did we develop the tools together, we, as you all know, we wrote the book together. So there was a larger interpretation of the committee approach. And I think this is an approach, team science is becoming a really major way to conduct research. Because I think research is a pretty lonely endeavor. I mean, I know for myself that how often I've just felt like I wish I had somebody else working with me on this project. Because there's something about intellectual exchange, there's something about the pressure of getting deadlines from one another that really enables us to move forward and to think in a wider or broader way than we normally would if we were just one lonely person sitting, you know, in front of the computer screen and trying to you know, to be productive. At least that's how I feel about it. Maybe there are others who are happy with doing it alone. But for me, this was really something that really helped me to you know, to engage intellectually, interculturally, across academic cultures too, across writing styles, across languages, in a way that was really very beneficial. So we were able to develop, I think we would call ourselves the Worlds of Journalism Study family, because we developed a true partnership. All of those virtual meetings and in-person meetings that we had, we were able to engage in a lot of cultural sensitivity and a lot of patience with each other, and an understanding that created a lot of mutuality, a lot of reciprocity, and a lot of responsiveness. And I think that was really a benefit that I had not expected. This is my third project, and not in sequence, first in sequence, but my third project in which I have engaged with a group of people from either different disciplines or different parts of the world. And I find it extremely rewarding because I learned so much from the process and from just meeting people with different ways of thinking. And so, as Thomas has already mentioned, one of the major goals, or one of the that we had and that we were able to accomplish, was this decolonization and de-Westernization of journalism studies, of not letting just the theories of the West become our interpretive foundation, and to listen carefully to what our colleagues had to say about how they would interpret the results from their particular points of view, located in their particular geographical location. So it was just a rich experience, and there was a richness, I feel, to the book that came from all of these non-Western voices. Not that I have anything against Western voices, but it was a real nice getting together of the non-Western and the Western. And I'm not going to tell you that this was all very easy. It wasn't. It was a lot of hard work on the part of a lot of people, starting with the process of just collecting data on journalists in these times, with very, critical methodological guidelines that we all were to follow. In many parts of the world, this is pretty difficult. I mean, there are journalists who've never seen a questionnaire in their life, before. And so none of this was an easy process, but it was a very rewarding process. And so as we engaged in the project and in the book, and in the interest of time, I will kind of end with just a few last words. There were many, many rewards in the process, but there were also many struggles. And I think we overcame these struggles a little bit more easily because we were this family of Worlds of Journalism Study, colleagues who were able to help each other out as we were struggling with ways how to collect data, or how to write a chapter, or how to interpret some data, and so on. So the rewards of in all of these years of getting all this together, and then finally for it to be topped by this award from the International Journal of Press and Politics, I think makes all of this worthwhile. If for anyone the team science or the committee approach was not sufficiently rewarding, then certainly everyone who participated in the book, I'm sure, feels very rewarded by this recognition. And so I want to thank the journal for giving us this award. And thank you all for listening to me. I'll stop there. I know that time is short. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas and Jyotika. Yes, time is short, unfortunately. There are a lot of interesting questions and comments in the chat, and I noticed that Thomas has already started answering them. So it would be appreciated if, you know, all authors, you know, take a close look at the chat after their presentation as you are doing. So thank you ever so much. I only want to add one thing, and, you know, again, there are lots of interesting questions in the chat, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. In terms of, you know, a global conversation, we as International Journal of Press Politics, partly to celebrate, you know, the seemingly global success of this conference, we have just launched a special edited collection that includes 29 articles from the Global South or around the Global South, or that adopt a global comparative perspective. And these articles are available for free to download for everybody until the end of October. I have pasted a link in the chat so that everybody can see it. Without further ado, I would like to move on to our first panel, which is focused on news coverage of public affairs. And I will be chairing this panel. Again, a little housekeeping before I give the floor to Kate Dommett. First of all, everyone, please mute yourselves, apart from the speakers, of course, and feel free to turn your video on and off as you see fit. Presentations will have 25 minutes that will include both the presentation and the Q&A and the questions and answers. So that if somebody's presentation is longer than what we recommended, there will be less time for discussion for that particular paper, not for everyone else's paper. The discussion will take place via the chat box. So anyone who has questions or comments, as we've been doing for the Words of Journalism presentation, please just write them in the chat, and the chair, in this case myself, will select a few and ask them to the presenter after the presentation. If there are more questions than time, we can answer them. Of course, the conversation will continue on the chat box. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Kate Dommett from the University of Sheffield, who has a paper on reporting the digital election campaign. Kate, please take it away.
Great, thanks. I'll get my presentation up. There we go, is that up full screen?
Yes.
Perfect, okay. Never quite know if it's gonna go right. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm really pleased to kick off this panel because I think there's some great papers here. What I'm gonna talk about today is a study that started off as a study of journalistic reporting and then ended up being about speaking to some conversations that I've been involved in over the past year around policy debates around democratic responsibilities and platform companies. So I'm going to start with that broader framing and then get into the specific case. But the case is discussed in much more detail in the paper that I've uploaded. So to give a bit of background, so I've been involved in some policy discussions in the UK over the last year about what's going on and what impact platform companies are having on elections, essentially. And there's been an awful lot of discussion and talk about what digital platforms should be compelled to do in order to kind of resolve certain problems and negative impacts they're being seen to have on democracy. And what's really struck me about those debates is that, firstly, the idea of democracy is often talked about in really abstract terms. So we're often treated as this self-evident ideal that clearly platforms and social media companies specifically is what I'm talking about with that term. You need to act to uphold democracy. But the second thing I've also been really struck with is that we tend to kind of treat social media platforms as standalone bodies when we're talking about these things. And kind of coming from a political science perspective, both of those presumptions that I see within the kind of current policy debate that's going on at the moment seem rather strange, because especially thinking from an institutionalist perspective, you know, an idea such as democracy is seen to be something that's constituted by multiple institutions and actors who collectively define what we mean by these terms. And that understanding really resonates for me because, you know, it helps us understand why democracy and democratic ideals look different in different places, and why we therefore need to be aware of the kind of local context when we're talking about what we understand democracy, and shouldn't treat it as this universal term. So thinking about that kind of understanding of what democracy is and how that relates to these broader debates about democratic responsibilities, I've been really struck that there seems to be an odd disconnect around this kind of question on the slide. You know, what should platforms be expected to do? You know, what is the reason to compel platforms to act and behave in a certain way? And I've not particularly found a very convincing answer to that question within current debates. And what I'm kind of want to suggest today and float as a proposition to discuss is that maybe one reason to think about democratic responsibilities and what we want these platforms to be doing is to think about them as interconnected institutions, or essentially one actor amongst many who have roles and collectively uphold what we mean by democracy in any given society. And if we think about it that way, I kind of became interested in asking, well, if we're interested in how platforms are situated alongside other institutions, then we need to ask how they are impacting upon other institutions and what might be concerning practices in that regard. So that's kind of the broad framing, I suppose, to kind of set up where I've ended up with the specific case I started with. And I think that this case really helps us think about these questions. And so to introduce kind of what I specifically looked at. So around the general election in the UK last year, I thought that it would be a kind of interesting example to look at what was happening around the coverage of digital election campaigning, which has become quite a prominent part of elections over recent years. And in the kind of context of this and the general setup I just established, I was interested in thinking about, well, how did the media as one institution within democratic society, how was the media's experience of covering the general election and specifically digital campaigning affected by platforms? And specifically, speaking to those debates about democracy, you know, how were journalists' democratic goals affected by platform behaviour, and are there therefore responsibilities that platforms should have to journalists as another institution within democratic society? So to answer and to think about these things, I went out and conducted some interviews with journalists. Nearly all of them are on the record, and you can kind of read de-anonymised quotes. Everyone gave, all but one interviewee gave permission to be named, and basically went to speak to journalists straight after their experience of covering the campaign about how they'd found it. And the purpose of those interviews was twofold. So firstly, I was interested in asking about what journalists' democratic goals were. So what was it they were trying to achieve through their coverage? And then secondly, how did they find the experience of covering the digital campaign during the election? And what that revealed was that journalists had two key democratic goals. And they're of interest to me because in thinking about the wider system, they're also widely established beyond journalists, and they were to inform citizens and to perform a watchdog function. So they really pick up on those established norms around, you know, having informed citizens, but also those systems of accountability that we expect within a democracy. So I was interested in then thinking about, well, how in practice was it possible for, to promote these goals? And how did platforms as another institution within the democracy affect that process? So to kind of dive into some of the detail, and I'm not going to do justice to what was a series of fascinating interviews, but to kind of provide a summary. So within the interviews, a kind of key distinction emerged pretty early on, which was in terms of covering digital campaigning and what was happening in the UK election, journalists talked about two key different types of content. So firstly, there was advertising and paid for content online, and then secondly, organic content, so material that was shared essentially without being paid for. And I think what it's worth saying at the very beginning is that when I was initially speaking to journalists about this election and digital campaigning, they were incredibly positive about their experience of being able to cover this, because for the first time there were a range of new resources that were available for journalists to be able to cover what was happening. So most notably, that was the political advertising archives that were created by Facebook and Google. But there were also some other tools. So CrowdTangle is the most notable one for organic content, which I'm sure many of you know allows you to kind of study on certain key platforms, how many members are in groups, the kind of posts and shares and interactions that occur on certain platforms online. So journalists were kind of saying that there were tools that were being provided by platform companies that allowed them to promote their democratic ideals. But that portion of the interview tended to kind of last about 5 minutes, and then we had 50 minutes of a whole lot of comments essentially saying that platforms also behaved in a whole raft of ways that really frustrated their ability to inform citizens and also to perform a watchdog function and scrutinise what was happening. And those frustrations tended to focus around what I'm calling data availability and data quality. So in terms of data availability, I suppose the headline here is that platforms are not making enough data available, and that whilst there have been huge advances in terms of the increased transparency we've seen at this election, there are many areas in which it's not possible to get information. So in terms of adverts and paid for content, we only see a few digital spaces providing archives of adverts, but also advertising isn't the only form of paid for content that we see within elections. You know, although it varies from different country to country as to what's allowed, you know, within the UK, you know, influencer campaigns are another way of spending money. There are other kind of ways in which money can be used, but what journalists were repeatedly saying is they ended up focusing most of their coverage on the Facebook advertising library because other information just wasn't available. And if things are bad in terms of paid for, then it was even worse in terms of organic content. So journalists just reported finding it incredibly frustrating to deal with the way that platforms made information available or the way that platform services have been designed. So things like encryption were seen to be a real barrier, the lack of systematic cross-platform access. There were so many issues cited, and you know the paper goes into this in more detail, but effectively the journalists I was speaking to just really said the issue of data was so problematic. They just didn't have the available insights to be able to inform citizens about what was going on, and therefore to be able to study with any regularity where anomalies or concerning practices might be coming up. So in addition to questions of data availability, there were also issues of data quality, and these are specifically about advertising archives. I think this is what mainly the journalists I spoke to were using for their coverage, and they had real frustrations. So these comments are mainly focused on the Facebook archive because it was the most predominantly used, but they do also apply to Google's. So the 4 issues that I've kind of summarized from the data I collected pertain to scope, functionality, precision, and accuracy. So in terms of scope, this kind of overlays with issues of availability, but the information that was provided by platforms was seen to be really limited and not equivalent with the information that platforms themselves possessed. So predominantly there have been a lot of concerns about the lack of insight on targeting data that platforms have made available through their resources. So Mike Wright at The Telegraph was very skeptical about what platforms had done and essentially thought of them more as a PR exercise rather than a meaningful source of transparency about what was happening in terms of advertising. Second, in terms of functionality, the team I spoke to at Sky had a whole raft of stories. Most of them weren't UK nationals, so it spent months and even some rejections actually even getting access to the API because their account wasn't created in the UK. But then once they did gain access to the API, there were issues around rate limits or technical glitches that meant that they couldn't gather data in a way that was seen to be reliable and that frustrated their reporting activity. In terms of precision, at the Financial Times, David Blood, who I spoke to, a data scientist there, talking about the stuff about the way that the manner in which platforms decided to report information really inhibited their reporting. So by using bands of spend rather than precise amounts, it really undermines journalists' ability to get that precision for the stories that they needed in order to be able to get the sign off to run them. So he said a lot of his work just never saw the light of day because it was seen to be too imprecise. And then at the BBC, they also really highlighted issues of accuracy. So these were also reported at other outlets. But particularly notable quote was saying, they were using the Google transparency data and then discovered that it wasn't accurate. And that really affected their ability to be able to report on what was happening. So this is just a quick taster of what I found essentially with what were just fascinating interviews. But to kind of start to bring it back to those bigger questions, in terms of why this matters and why I think it's interesting to think about these things, I think what the interviews that I did revealed were that journalists' goals in terms of informing citizens and wanting to perform this watchdog function were substantially affected by the decisions and actions that platforms were being taken. So there's a real interconnection there between how platforms are operating and how the media is. And this was just evident again and again in quotes that showed that journalists were not able to provide, to run stories or provide coverage that ultimately would really help advance their democratic goals. So I think this is kind of interesting to think about, because for me, it starts to speak to these broader debates I was highlighting about platform responsibility, because at the moment, and I myself have been involved in some of these debates, but there's a very live, there's a significant move to compel platforms to act and to rectify some of the issues that journalists were confronting. So just to summarize a few of the proposals that have been made, there have been calls for compulsory advertising archives made from within government in the UK itself. There have been calls for greater access for researchers to be able to access information and get a more comprehensive picture of what's going on. And there have been calls for audits of platform information with the power to compel platforms to provide information to regulators, but also to other actors such as in the media. And this brings me back to that question, well, why should platforms be doing these things? And is it actually problematic if platforms are behaving in a way that are frustrating the media's goals and frustrating the promotion of ideas that are shared more widely within democracy? And I think if we think about democracy as something that is constructed and upheld by many institutions, and we don't see it as an abstract, almost predefined ideal, but something that is about interconnections, that is about recognizing and understanding the specific ideals that are held and promoted by institutions in a specific location, then there starts to be a case for saying that maybe the way that platforms are behaving and the fact that they are making decisions and disclosing information in a way that is frustrating the ability of other institutions to uphold democratic ideals is problematic, and that we should be taking action to compel platform companies to do something about this and to act in accordance to promote these ideals that are being upheld. But what I want to pause and come to a close on is to say that I think this is a useful way of thinking about why platforms should be maybe forced to take action. But I also think that it also suggests that we need to do some broader thinking about this, because at the moment, there have been a lot of calls for platforms to take action. But if we're thinking about and justifying the reason for that action as being about the interconnections, then I think we also need to think about what we are requesting of other institutions, because currently we're calling for platforms to have greater levels of transparency, but we're not calling for political parties to do the same or to provide the same kind of archives of campaign material. So I think that if this is the kind of rationale for prompting platforms to act, then we need to think about whether the same norms are actually being imposed and upheld in all institutions within society. Because it feels to me that there's a danger that social media platform companies are being subject to requests and demands to change that aren't being uniformly applied. So I want to kind of bring it to a close there, but I think the kind of question that I want to ask everyone listening is kind of, is this a valuable way to think about platforms' democratic obligations and responsibilities? And is this kind of case study a useful way of thinking about that debate? But I would also be absolutely fascinated to hear any questions, and I'm very happy to go into more detail about the specific interviews and what I found, because I've only been able to give a very slight taster.
Thank you very much, Kate, for a very fascinating presentation and a really great project. You've touched upon a lot of important issues, and we have quite a few questions already. I will bundle a few in one, if you don't mind, and then we'll, more are coming up. But I think some broad questions here. To whom are those, so Jem asks, to whom are these platforms accountable to in the UK in terms of law? Renee is asking, do you think these platforms should be regulated by law? And along the same lines or similar lines, Lenny was asking, do you think that after Cambridge Analytica and what happened with the Leave campaign in particular, there should be restrictions or guidelines on platforms in general so that they don't have too much influence? So I think these are related questions that you can perhaps answer all together, and then hopefully we have time for a couple more.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in platform law, I'll put that out there straight away. But in the UK, my understanding is that the kind of current rules that we have are very piecemeal, and they tend to be, around kind of offensive content, for example. There are laws that apply more broadly than to platforms. And what we're currently at the moment in the UK is a real attempt to write more platform specific law, but also to update existing law. So the area that I'm most expert in is around electoral regulation, but to make sure that existing provisions are applicable to platforms, because it does feel that there is a gap within a lot of existing legislation and existing requirements. So I think that kind of brings me to the question of, do I think that platforms should be regulated? And I think my own personal answer is yes. I do think there is a case for putting these institutions that have an extensive amount of power within different contexts to subject them to the laws of that context. I think I am more in favour of having localised regulations. I think there's a real tension between the need to have global responses to how these platforms operate. But I do think that, in kind of line with the point I was making about, different democracies have different values and ideals. And so I do think there is a case for specific contexts promoting their own regulation and deciding how they want platforms to operate and be regulated within their own specific contexts.
Thank you, Kate. Another question from Darsana, who is inquiring whether, apart from the issue of restricted data availability, did you come across any issues where journalists felt that when they were writing articles that were critical of the advertising models or messaging of certain political parties, those articles would get lower reach on these platforms?
That's not something that was reported. I guess because it would be very difficult for them to trace. Mainly their frustrations were about actually the kind of monitoring and tracing in real time, where they just experienced so many barriers that they didn't feel able to do their job.
Right. Another question from Aza, which I think speaks to your point about local regulation. The question is, can we trust that governments will put public interest at the forefront of regulation, in particular in autocratic countries that have taken advantage of these platforms to restrict access to and silence independent journalists?
Yeah, that is a really excellent point. I think, for me, I kind of think that government does have to take action, but I don't think that any one part of the landscape is alone going to be able to solve the issues around social media companies. I think, for me, it's about thinking about the action that governments can take, that civil society can take, and the platforms themselves can take, but also I do think there's a role for citizens in this game. I think the whole debate around how we respond to and regulate platforms can tend to point. I effectively think that, like, I take your point, and I think that we do need to be aware that in some places governments, you know, we can't just leave it to them. It's about thinking and recognizing about how different parts of society can take action collectively, so that we're not ever entirely reliant upon one part.
Thank you. We have a question from Bazuni, which I'll summarize as, do we need to free or restrict the platforms?
I think they've already had a lot of freedom. I think that it's been interesting. I've been working with government to try and work with platforms around addressing some of these issues, and I think that experience has led me to be a little bit more skeptical about giving platforms freedom, because I've seen an awful lot of resistance to change and an unwillingness to act, and I think that it has reached a stage where there is a case for regulation or some kind of legal imperative that requires platforms to act, because having seen the kind of diplomatic attempts to have influence softly, they don't seem to be particularly effective.
Yes. I think we have time for one more, and this comes from Ayala, who mentions that in doing her interviews in Israel with journalists, she felt that they saw social platforms as extremely powerful, whereas journalists felt a bit powerless. Did you find something similar in the UK regarding that balance of power?
That's a great question. That's really fascinating to hear you've kind of come up with something similar. That is definitely something that I found reported an awful lot. So I think it was particularly evident in the fact that, you know, the journalists recognized that as much as they had criticism of these platforms, they'd also been given tools that just had transformed their ability to do their job. And it really brought home the fact that they were very reliant upon platforms to, you know, to gain any access, but were also incredibly frustrated by the fact that they were also dependent upon the gift of these platforms, and they had no power to compel information disclosure from them. So I think that kind of power imbalance is really interesting. And I do think that within the context of debates around democracy, it does raise concerns.
Okay, Kate, that was brilliant and also right on time. So thank you very much for that as well. And thanks for getting us started on such a high note. So it is now my pleasure to give the floor to Wad Arif from the University of Leeds, who is going to present a study on narratives of terrorism.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just going to share my presentation. All right. Okay. So I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of CNN and Al Arabiya on their English-Arabic website. So this investigates the similarities of the media coverage and narrative of terrorism and the domestication and familiarization of the news. So what I refer by domestication and familiarization, which was introduced by Gorbach and Levy in 1990, as the process of reshaping, reorganizing, and reproducing the news to become more suitable for the targeted audience according to their culture, their political structure, and the ideology that they serve. So I'm focusing, as I said, on examining CNN and Al Arabiya and their English and Arabic versions. So I'm basically doing 4 comparisons of these 4 news outlets to see do they report in one voice or many voices for their different types of audiences. So this study provides us with insights regarding the media coverage of terrorism and the field of news domestication and familiarization, as well as the use of a narrative approach, especially since previous literature have focused, which have examined the different language services of the same news organization, were mostly in the translation field. However, in this study, I'm taking it from a more media perspective and a more a narrative approach. So these are my main research questions. As I said, I'm looking at the differences and similarities in the reporting and storytelling of terrorism. And then I want to see how does news domestication and familiarization relate to the way CNN and Al Arabiya report attacks. So the data collection, all acts of non-state terrorism that occurred in 2017 were collected, excluding countries of civil war due to their association with other state and governmental conflicts, and they were collected from the Global Terrorism Database. However, a systematic sampling was used for the Islamist terrorist attacks in order to conduct a more in-depth qualitative analysis. So in total, we have 588 news stories were selected and analyzed for the study. And these stories included right-wing terrorism, left-wing terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and the other category, which included racist attacks or hate crimes. Okay, so moving on to the methodology, narratives play a role in constructing information and cultural meanings from social realities that are manifested in a sequence of events, and they can revolve around a certain conflict and include characters, in my case, such as the perpetrators, victims, heroes, vulnerable individuals, and so on. And it looks at journalism as a way of storytelling and how journalists can play as professional storytellers who present their news and make the unfamiliar more familiar to their targeted audience. And this is relevant to the concept of news domestication. This study draws upon Reisman levels of analysis and narrative studies and Pershall and Baker work. So I'm basically looking at the themes of the news story, the structure of the news story, looking at how it was structured and organized, looking at the plot, the scene, the characters' representation, the drama involved, and so on. And I'm also looking at the function of some headlines and how they play sometimes as a clickbait to attract more audiences, and also the consequences and effects of certain type of storytelling. So during the observation and the analysis, I found 4 different forms of journalistic storytelling that were developed. We have emotional storytelling. And in this type of storytelling, you can see emotional and humanization themes are more dominant, where they tend to provide personal information about the victims, their image, their portraits, and they talk about their heroic acts, their acts of bravery, and talking about their lifestyle or charity work and their voluntarily work and their beliefs and so on. And then we have factual storytelling, which is more about a descriptive reporting, where you can see the primary information of the attack, answering questions of when, how, why, where. And then we have an emotional storytelling or the multi-perspectival storytelling. And this is similar in nature to the peace journalism approach, which can include different sides of the story, different perspectives, and various types of sources, and more analytical pieces and interpretative reporting. And then we have storytelling, where you can see some narratives of othering and also some stereotypical images. So talking about the findings, the victims' racial and cultural and religious identities can determine the level of humanization and emotionality. For example, CNN International heavily uses emotional storytelling with Western white victims in particular, and especially of Islamic terrorism, whereby the Arabic outlets tend to use more factual storytelling that lacks emotions, except when the victims are Arabic or Muslim. And I found this case especially in right-wing terror attacks against Muslims, where you can see narratives of emotionality and humanization start appearing. And you can also see sometimes some signs of domestication. For example, Arabic in their coverage of the Istanbul nightclub attack that occurred in January in 2017, they focused heavily on the Saudi victims in particular, and they presented them in a good image, the well-educated person who cares deeply about Middle Eastern affairs and refugees, and they talked about their achievements and their personal so they focused heavily in this case on emotional narratives. And then we have Islamist attacks against non-Western and non-Arabic victims, and left-wing attacks garnered a lower level of humanization, and these were normally framed and narrated in political conflict frames, and sometimes in local conflicts and violence themes, without relying much on humanization or emotionality. CNN International tend to describe white perpetrators in less aggressive terms than Islamist perpetrators. However, Al-Arabiya Arabic represents white perpetrators in a more negative way of storytelling. Even though sometimes they cite the same sources, however, Al-Arabiya Arabic tries to cite and present a more aggressive and a more negative image of the white perpetrators in particular. For example, in the Las Vegas shooting attack, where CNN International, of course, there wasn't any narratives or themes of terrorism. And CNN International described the perpetrator in many cases as a retired accountant who was kind, caring, quiet, and had no tendencies or ties with any groups, whereby Al-Arabiya Arabic described the attack as a Satan attack, a dreadful attack, and they talked a lot about the family of the perpetrator and his father. And also in the Finsbury Park attack, for example, where CNN International cited a source talking about the perpetrator as someone who was kind, normal, and he was singing with his kids. However, Arabiya Arabic represented him as a miserable alcoholic who was obsessed with killing Muslims and was aggressive towards his children. So you can see the differences between these outlets in particular, especially when covering right-wing terrorism. CNN International emphasized on the original hometown of the perpetrators who hold Western nationality to create a sense of separation. For example, in the Manchester pumping arena, Salman and Abidi, who is originally from Libya, they tried to make a separation between his Western nationality and his original hometown, and used some narratives of othering, and you can see how they tried to separate between them, and sometimes they describe these Islamist terrorists as terrorists living in the West. And they always emphasize on how he had just returned from Libya, or that he had just converted to Islam, to create this sense of detachment. However, for the Arabic outlets, they emphasize on the original hometown of the Western with their targeted audience. So you can see the differences here. How they emphasize on his Libyan descent or his original hometown in order to create a sense of familiarization, and such as citing his Libyan family, talking about or citing the perspective of the Libyan community living in the West, for example, and also talking about the Libyan family and their political stance and political activities with Al-Gaddafi government, for example. So they emphasize on this factor in particular to create a sense of familiarization with their targeted audience and what they might care about. The existence of some stereotypical images against Muslims were found in the coverage of CNN International, for example, portraying people who are dressed Islamically as terrorists and linking the Islamic term Allahu Akbar to terrorism, where CNN International in the Manhattan truck attack, they described or defined this term as a slogan that jihadist terrorists often use when they are carrying out an operation, thus making this phrase seem to be a term used by these terrorists without clearly highlighting its spiritual and peaceful meaning. However, for example, for CNN Arabic, they try to separate between Islam and terrorism, and they do not refer to this term heavily. In some cases, CNN International used blame narratives that place the blame on Islamist extremists who motivated white perpetrators to perpetrate attacks against Muslims. In some cases, for example, also in the Finsbury Park attack, where they provide the previous incident perpetrated by Islamist terrorists, and then they say that that's why the white perpetrator has perpetrated or was motivated by these previous attacks. So that's why he did this attack against Muslims. So you can see some blame narratives here. In right-wing terrorism, the coverage of CNN International was constantly linked to the failure of Donald Trump actions and his statement and racist behavior. You can see in right-wing terrorism how they provided a significant space talking or criticizing Donald Trump and his action and his statement, and they discussed the current debates between the Democrats and the Republicans. So you can see that sometimes they do not focus on the attack itself or humanizing the victims, but they provide a large space for criticizing Donald Trump. In many cases, journalists narrate the news using a familiar voice when addressing their targeted audience. For example, Arabic coverage of the Manchester bombing attack. One of the headlines was Manchester, the city of Saudi and Arab students in the United Kingdom. This might function as a clickbait because even though the content story was not about the Saudi or Arabs in the United Kingdom, however, it was mostly talking about the attack and how it was unfolded and talking about the victims. But maybe they use this, and this can be regarded as a sign of education and also to attract more audiences. Another example in CNN Arabic and their coverage of right-wing attack, they said, our mothers and sisters go out on streets are easily recognized for wearing the veil and have become easy targets. And you can see some narratives of belonging here, that they are one of us, so they are adopting the voice of the Muslim community, talking about their experiences, the challenges that they face, their daily lives living in the West. And you can see that domestication and familiarization of the news are embedded in these lines and how they showcase the feelings and the experiences of the Muslim community. And then we have Al Arabiya English present its news to an English-speaking audience and in a familiar way to those living in the West, while not abusing the ideology that it serves. So you can see that Al Arabiya English sometimes is similar to CNN International in their journalistic characters, in citing some international sources and Western sources in particular, and involving very many discussions that can be a bit similar to the West, and we will talk about this in a minute. But they don't try to abuse the ideology that they serve, so they try to stay a bit more balanced and neutral than Al Arabiya on the Saudi agenda, for example, due to the Saudi Arabian sponsorship. So you can, Al Arabiya English does not emphasize a lot on this agenda. They try to stay more balanced and neutral, but however would not some familiarization narratives in Al Arabiya English, which try to present its news to a more Western audience, are evident in some narratives and discussions when reporting for terrorism, such as talking about gun control and the debate between Republicans and Democrats, and then shootings, fake news, Brexit, and also casino markets. And we don't see that a lot in Al Arabiya Arabic in their coverage of terrorism.
Wow, we have 5 minutes left in your between presentation and discussion.
I'm about to finish now. Yeah, okay, so I'm about to finish now. Arabic take advantage when talking about terrorism to highlight the differences between the treatment of non-Muslim and Islamist attacks. Also, some familiarization narratives were found in CNN International. The conclusion, the foreign news outlets did not simply translate or report the news without considering their target audience, so it was not basically just translation. Emotional storytelling was, and also multi-perspectival storytelling was observed more in the English outlets. However, factual storytelling was observed more in the Arabic outlets, and I think this subject could be further developed and enriched by conducting interviews with the journalists to reach more results about this. Yeah, and sorry for the time. Okay, I'm finished.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. Appreciate that. It's always difficult to keep time in an online setting. So we have quite a few questions, and we might not be able to go through all of them, but please take a look at them afterwards. I want to read at least a couple now. I think the first one, which probably might be helpful to clarify a few issues from Zvati. What is the difference between stereotypical and factual storytelling?
Okay, so factual storytelling is mostly around presenting just the main information without talking a lot about going deep. So they're just answering questions of how, when, where this attack took place, who did it, and it was more descriptive and basic reporting, and it was seen heavily in CNN Arabic in particular. However, stereotypical images, stereotypical storytelling is when you see some stereotypical images and narratives, as I said, narratives of othering and sometimes linking Islam to terrorism. So this is when I regarded it as a stereotypical storytelling, when you can see some stereotypical images.
Thank you. And I'm sure this will continue in the chat. I think there is a question from Sudeshna, to which I would like to also tag a question from Aza. So Sudeshna is asking, what are the reasons that you have hypothesized for this differential narrative framing by the two channels? And so you refer to, for example, audience considerations in your final slide. Aza is also asking, along these lines, would it be reasonable to conclude that the political restraints that come with the location of each outlet's headquarters affect coverage? For example, CNN Arabia is based in Dubai.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I wanted to look at CNN and Al Arabiya in particular because in previous literature, some have criticized Al Arabiya for being more Americanized. So I wanted to compare between these two, and especially since Al Arabiya is also an important Middle Eastern player in the region. So I wanted to compare it with CNN, and also looking at how the different language news services would report terrorism news for their audiences. Would they consider, as we said, the geographic location and so on? And some CNN, one of the editors in CNN Arabic have actually stated in Al-Badri book that CNN Arabic was established after 9/11 and during the Iraq War to become more closer to their Arabic audience and present more news that can be relevant to them. So that's why I was very interested in this factor in particular. And also, as I said, since most previous literature have looked at the translation, where they compared between some translation theories and grammatical differences between these two. But I found in my study that it was, they did conduct original reporting, and they did consider their targeted audience when in trying to include different narratives and different discussions that can attract their targeted audience. So yeah, I hope that I answered their questions. So yeah, this is what I was interested about the most.
Thank you, Wad. There are quite a few other comments and questions that I hope you'll find interesting. And again, please, everybody, keep talking in the chat if you feel like it. We don't have time to go through everything here, but the conversation can continue. Thank you very much, Wad. It's been a pleasure, and hope you continue enjoying the conference. And now we have the final paper in this first panel, Uneven Parts, Uneven Whole, Political Parties' Access to Radio and Television in Contemporary Poland, by Radoslav Sojak, Andrzej Meller, and Beata Krolicka. If any of the authors is here, can you please take the floor?
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Let me just start by saying that we wish we were there or you were here. It doesn't really matter, but we are a bit tired by this virtual world. Okay, we are, as you can also see.
Andrei, sorry, let me interrupt you 1 second. We can see your screen, but we can see the presenter mode in PowerPoint rather than the screen, the slideshow mode. So it should be possible to. I mean, it's fine this way, but it would be bigger if we saw it in the slide.
Okay, we'll try to sort out technical issues, but let me go into the narrative. Okay, yeah, so we shall work it out, I hope. So we are a small team, and our study started out of curiosity and a very unsettling observation on Polish political culture. And I'm not really sure whether it is a unique feature of Polish politics, or is it more universal. But in Poland, politicians constantly complain about media. They complain they are omitted, misrepresented, manipulated, and we wanted to establish whether these complaints have any grounds on the level of the media system as a whole. So we started collecting our data daily on the appearances of politicians in most important political shows in Poland, in order to answer the question whether media system keeps balance and provides democracy the discourse environment it needs. So we start with some basic introductory information on Polish political and media system. Then we go to our theoretical framework and research questions, some remarks on methodology, and then we'll go to our findings. So what you have to know about Polish politics is that we have a parliamentary cabinet system with proportional representation, and what is probably the most important feature here is the don't counting method, which is heavily skewed towards bigger parties. Since 2007, we kind of evolved towards the two-party system, and on 2015 we had a very serious shakeup of political scene that is quite often interpreted as a kind of populist turn, or as an example of a populist turn in a global politics. We had a conservative contender winning the presidential election. The contender was backed by the party called Law and Justice. And soon after the presidential election, Law and Justice won the parliamentary election, gaining outright majority for the first time in the post-communist history of Poland. What you can see on this graph are the results of the election, showing the popular votes and the parliamentary seats. As you can see, the Dommett method benefits the larger parties heavily. As far as the Polish media is concerned, we are of the strange nature. We are like a strange animal in a pack, as you can see by this Halin and Mancini scheme here. We have a strong grasp of the government on public media, followed by the very loose control of private media in Poland. And if you follow some debates on Polish politics, you may notice that public media are at the heart of the debate. They are often accused of being biased or pro-government and very propagandistic. And everyone who follows the Polish politics knows that Polish public media were always politically controlled. Well, by always, I mean after the fall of the communism. So these are the basic information on the context of our study, and now some information on our methodology and research questions.
Again, we're still seeing the presentation in presenter mode. It's fine, you know, if you can't get it on slideshow, but you know, just so as you know.
While doing it, and to what extent private and public broadcasters preserve plurality and provide the proportional access for political parties. And looking for a model to compare with, we found a text written by Ferrer et al. In 2002, titled "4 Models of the Public Sphere in Modern Democracies." And we have chosen one model, representative liberal model, focuses on who participates in public discourse. And this model opts for dominance of elites and assumes that citizens should be or are passive most of the time. So their most important duty is to take part in voting. So the basic criteria of these models are transparency of the exercising of power, and for our purpose, for our research, is proportionality. This model assumes that the more votes party gains, the more share to the media should have. So according to the model, based on this model, we prepared norm of representativeness as a criterion for description, for normative description of the particular party media public presence. So we propose, based on this model, we propose norm of representativeness as a criterion, and it is calculated as average of 2 values. The first value is the percentage of valid electoral votes, and the second value is the percentage of seats won during the elections. And as you can see in this table, the first column is we can see share of votes in 2015 election, and in the second column we can see share of seats in the same. It means our lower chamber of parliament. So as Law and Justice Party gained 38% and had 51%. So the norm of representativeness is just an average of these 2 values, 44%.
Thank you, Jyotika. Impact, we referring to potential impact rather than actual impact. And we used 3 factors to record this impact: appearance, duration, and market reach. And we use, when we use the term appearance, we don't mean how a political representatives looks or what they wear. Instead, we're doing to the who, when, and where of the appearance or presence in media. We use this data to our basic indicator, and on this we added duration. It means how long appearance is assumed to last. We estimated this by dividing the duration of the single program by the number of the guests in this program, and so on. We used market reach. To clarify what we mean by market reach, we can say it's share of audience of the station in which interview take place. So finally, we have go impact indicator, which is appearance weighted by duration and market reach. Now I'm going to move to the next slide, where I prepared 2 graphs to better explain on the example how impact is. On this graph, you can see trends of appearance and impact for 2 chosen parties. On the graphs left for Law and Justice, we see that the line of the impact is higher than the line of the appearance. That means that the Law and Justice with its media presence achieve a greater potential impact than the average in the analyzed period. We can estimate that it's result both from the giving interview in the station with the large market range and from relatively more frequent giving an interview in a 1-to-1 format. Then time duration is not dividing. In contrast, on the right graph, we see impact, the line of impact and the line of appearance for cookies. And we see that the line of impact is lower than appearance. And in this case, we can estimate that cookies MPs appearance take place in controversial interviews when they invited to interview with more than one guest, and so their time is divided. I hope that this short analysis has allowed you to grasp the essence of our indicators. You can visit our our website where we have made our data freely available, and then let's go to findings.
Okay, what you see in this picture is the graph of the impact for major parliamentary parties during 2015-2019 term. And you can clearly see that the ruling party is enjoying impact hovering around 50%, which is slightly above the norm of representativeness that we've established. You can also see, which is kind of a distressing trend, that the largest opposition party, PO, Civic Platform, has a decreasing trend of impact in media, and at the end of this term, it reaches the levels of the smaller parliamentary parties. The other parties enjoy media representation pretty much on par with the norm of representativeness established on the results of the election. Here you can see the indicator of representativeness for all political parties in term 2015-2019, and you can clearly see that most of the parties are being a little bit overrepresented, with the notable exception of the Civic Platform, the biggest opposition party. Of course, interpreting this data, you have to remember that indicator of representativeness is established or based on norm of representativeness, and it is a big difference when the party is a little bit overrepresented, with a norm being on 44%, as compared with the party who is a little bit overrepresented, with a norm calculated at the level of 5 or 6%. But to understand this data a little bit deeper, we provide you indicators of representativeness for political parties in public versus private media. And here you can clearly see that these are private media that contribute to balancing the system of media coverage as a whole. First of all, you can see that non-parliamentary parties have much higher access to private media than they have to public television and radio. You can clearly see, this is on the right side of the graph, that the Civic Platform, the biggest opposition party, enjoys much higher, almost twice as high as in public media representation in private broadcasters. You can clearly see that the ruling party is overrepresented by public media. Although you have to also acknowledge that other smaller opposition parties are also being a little bit overrepresented in public television and radio. It is also a helpful thing to analyze our data, not by parties, by individual parties, but by power divide. So on this graph, you may see the number of opposition party representatives per one appearance of a ruling party member. And as you can clearly see here, these appearances are almost balanced on the level of the whole system. Again, the private media balance out some pro-government bias by a public media. And as the conclusion, some general remarks and some new data. First of all, we conclude that Polish media system preserves or adheres to model of external pluralism, meaning that it provides a plurality of opinion on the level of the system as a whole, not on the level of individual broadcasters. The two things are particularly more worrisome for us. First of all, it seems that our media system plays a very conservative role within our political system. It rather conserves the divides, nor shakes them up or changes things on a political scene. And the other cause for alarm, in our opinion, is the fact that all indicators of plurality worsened significantly at the end of the term, just before election. But because our data are collected daily, we can give you a hint on the situation nowadays, hence the graph on the right side of this picture showing you the access to the media after the parliamentary elections we had in 2019. And one general comment, all parties enjoy the access to the media system justified by the electoral result. And the final conclusion thus would be that we found no significant departures from the democratic standard on the level of the media on the level of the media system as a whole. And the other thing is that our media system seems to be very efficient self-regulatory system. And I really find this last conclusion a bit distressing because there were no informations about Poland in your study on journalistic cultures, but I bet that Polish journalists would score somewhere around monitorial model. And if so, then it is clear that our media system as a whole is not really playing this monitorial role at all. Thank you very much. And we are happy to answer any questions. Cristian, you muted yourself.
Thank
Cristian,
you very much.
I think you muted yourself.
Yes, sorry, I'm here, sorry. Thank you very much. We have a few questions from the chat, and again, as a public service announcement, please everyone feel free to ask questions in the chat, and also presenters, if we don't get to ask all the questions in the chat, please take some time to read them and answer them, and please feel free to still use the chat system. So we have one question from Svati, who is asking, broadly speaking, what is your assessment of the role of public and private media organizations in the democratic system of Poland?
Generally speaking, they balance themselves out as far as we understand. The public media have a quite strong position on the market. It's almost 30% of viewership and 15% of listenership for radio. And they share a substantial part of the advertisement budget in Poland. And they are always being controlled by whoever gains the power. We have a regulatory body that is a constitutional body in Poland. It is appointed by parliament and by president. And the regulatory body enjoys a rather broad margin of freedom and independence, and they keep, I think, balance on the level of the system as a whole. We have in Poland the situation that with a very strong and deep political divides, and almost all media are now accused of being partisan one way or the other. Our study started, and we wanted to quantify. We wanted to quantify our data and our answers, because
sorry, anyone can everyone please mute their microphones, please?
But we wanted to quantify our data and to give our answer on the quantitative level, because you can find a lot of examples of bad journalism and manipulation on every side in Polish media system, and it kind of felt futile for us to study this on a qualitative level, because we were afraid that we will be forced to join one camp or the other in the battle. So not only media, but also studying media in Poland is difficult.
Yeah, and there is a question along these lines, and it's probably going to be the last one we have time for, from Lenny, who is asking whether the fact that media in Poland is political, does that keep people away from wanting to study media, or does that actually encourage people to study it in hopes to understand it and change it? And I guess, both in terms of students, but also in terms of academics like you.
It's a funny one, there are a lot of people studying media in Poland, but most of them do study media abroad or study global or international media, like social media. Not many places in Poland studying Polish media, and I think it has some political reasons. You are very prone to being accused of being political when studying Polish media.
Right. Well, that sounds familiar to me as an Italian. So thank you very much, guys. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. That concludes our first panel.